Hello, everyone. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 10 of Energy vs. Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. Today, on our last show of Season 4, we have a special topic and a very special guest. First, the topic. The terms solar geoengineering, climate engineering, and solar radiation modification all refer to a set of approaches proposed to cool the planet in the face of global warming. For the purposes of today, we'll use solar geoengineering as our preferred term. And as most DVC listeners know, our own David Keith is one of the world's foremost researchers in the field. Within the climate mitigation world, these approaches are controversial to say the least. Whether or not we should even move forward with research on solar geoengineering is a topic of considerable debate. You may even have seen David versus David, that is to say, David Keith debating David Suzuki on their nature of things earlier this year. And if you haven't, check it out on CBC Gem. Today we're diving headlong into the briar patch of controversy that is solar geoengineering. We'll take advantage of David's expertise by having him deliver a primer on what it is, where it's at, and how we got to considering it as a mitigation approach in the first place. Then we'll turn to our special guest for her take on and involvement in solar geoengineering. That special guest is the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. Kim held elective office at all three levels of the Canadian government, and of course served as Canada's 19th and first female Prime Minister in 1993. She was also the first woman to hold the Justice and Defence portfolios, and is a founding member of the Club de Madrid and of the Council of Women World Leaders. Kim's connection to solar geoengineering is through the Global Commission on Governing Risks from Climate Overshoot, also known as the Climate Overshoot Commission, of which she is a commissioner. The Commission's mandate is to recommend a strategy to reduce risks should goals to contain global warming not be met. Kim joined us from Florence, Italy. Now here's the show. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So the format for today's show, we're going to get to David's primer. I'm going to have a quick chat with Kim, and then we open it up to discussion amongst all of us. We'll have our usual Q&A, and hopefully we'll get some hot button questions. So David, can you tell us about, first off, the ABC 1, 2, 3, and what is solar geoengineering? How does it work, and how did we get here?
Well, so it's the idea of humans deliberately altering the radiative balance of the Earth, the balance between incoming sunlight and the infrared light that goes out that keeps the climate in balance. It's about humans deliberately doing that to reduce some of the risks of climate change. So some of the ideas for doing it are everything from real science fiction, the idea of putting a giant shield in between the Earth and the sun, to putting aerosols, pollution like sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, sort of twice as high as a conventional aircraft flies, where you might put enough of these sulfuric acid droplets that you'd scatter away something like 0.5% or 1% of incoming sunlight. And the idea is that would reduce many aspects of climate change. We'll get to that in a minute. And it's also important to say it, in some respects, is related to two other processes. Volcanoes cool the planet, and we actually know that quite well and observed it and predicted it before we've observed the cooling. And volcanoes cool the planet also by putting sulfuric acid in the stratosphere. So it's, in some sense, it's mimicking that. In addition, humans put aerosol pollution in the atmosphere. And to be clear, aerosols are just kind of a fancy science word for a really small particle that's so small it doesn't fall out quickly from the atmosphere. So humans pump a lot of aerosols into the atmosphere, which is hugely toxic. It's air pollution. It kills people, but it also cools the planet. So we are, in fact, cooling the planet now with human aerosols, which means if we instantly stopped all industrial pollution, we'd actually see warming, not cooling in the short term. But then to continue with the methods, it's also possible we could reduce some kinds of cirrus clouds, which would let more infrared light out, or we could make some kinds of marine low-lying clouds brighter, or we could make the surface brighter. So that's some kind of idea of how it might be done. This is, as you said, controversial, and even the name is controversial. So I'm calling it here solar geoengineering, but it's often called solar radiation modification by the IPCC, but also climate repair or climate intervention by some advocates, or planet hacking by some detractors. Maybe the best way to understand it is in relation to the other things we do about climate. So at least the way I think about it, there are sort of four fundamental physical responses to the climate risk. one, which has really been the whole subject of this podcast, is all about decarbonization, about altering the industrial infrastructure of the planet so we don't emit carbon dioxide. No question we have to do that, and we can. The second one of the four is the idea that we could remove carbon from the atmosphere, which breaks the link between historical emissions of carbon dioxide and the current concentrations of carbon dioxide that drives climate change. And we talked about that a little bit on the show. The third is solar geoengineering, which doesn't break, but maybe weakens the link between whatever is the immediate concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and the amount of climate change. And then fourth, very important, is adaptation, which again doesn't break, but weakens the link between actual climate changes and human or environmental impacts. So, maybe the biggest question about these technologies is how well they might work and how big are their risks in comparison to the benefits. And the first thing to say is, well, that might sound like a scientific question that could be objectively answered. It can't be, because the answers depend fundamentally on political choices about how we use these technologies. So how much we use solar geoengineering, how even it is east to west and north to south, and what method is used. So there are certainly some ways it could be done where it would be profoundly destructive. So if you did it only in one hemisphere, we know we shift the region of rains in the tropics with for sure terrible consequences in some regions. So anybody who has an objective answer without qualification that solar geoengineering does A or B, you should ask yourself, assuming what about solar geoengineering? So if it was used roughly evenly, and if it was used not instead of cutting emissions, but as a supplement to cutting emissions, so we used a relatively small amount to reduce temperatures in addition to emissions cuts and carbon removal, then the evidence from kind of a host of climate models, and really at this point, a lot of science, there's sort of been a taboo against research, so it's not deep, but there's now decades and 1,000 papers. The evidence is kind of surprising that it really looks like it might work quite well in reducing many of the key climate risks, extreme temperatures, extreme storms that cause big flooding events, average temperature, sea level rise, and do that in a way that's pretty even. The big question, of course, is that correct? Are these models right or wrong? And how wrong might they be? But the evidence from the current set of models and studies under these conditions where it's used in this kind of benevolent way, the implications are that it really might be quite useful as a supplement to reducing risks, and that the amount of risk reduction might be quite large, much larger than the harms it brings. There's no question there's a whole lot of physical risks, air pollution to damaging the ozone layer, reducing sunlight, et cetera. There's a laundry list of thousands of risks, but many of them we've actually looked at in some detail now, and it looks like they're sort of quantitatively small compared to the benefits. So that's a very short summary of the science side. Of course, what I haven't talked about yet, which in many ways is the biggest question, I'm really interested to hear what Kim has to say, is how on earth we make decisions about this, about governing it, about outlawing it, or making decisions to use it, about research, et cetera. So that's my short primer. Over to you, Ben.
Maybe just one follow-up, David. Can you give us a sense of research that's been done to date? And as you say, still there's some, but more. When we'll talk about more research shortly. But if you were to try to quantify the benefit to risk ratio, you'd mentioned a couple of the risks, and I think you said precipitation, air quality and ozone layer, but is it a 10-to-1 ratio? Is it a 100-to-1 ratio? And knowing that depends on how it's deployed, where it's deployed, and what quantity it's deployed. But give us a sense of that trade-off.
So, funny you should ask that, because I think just this week, our draft paper is going up on the RFF, Resources for the Future website that has these numbers for maybe the first time. So we've done an effort to use these modern quantifications of heat-related mortality, how many people die from cold and hot in different places, and use that with a state-of-the-art climate model to predict if you did a cooling of about 1 degree centigrade late this century from solar geoengineering, you could predict how many people's lives would be saved by solar geoengineering. That's about 1 million a year in that scenario. And then we can compare that to other work that's been done to estimate the air pollution and ozone deaths, which turn out to be about 10,000. So that would be a ratio of sort of 100-to-1, where the benefits would be about 100 times bigger than the risks. But again, this shows you how thin this is. This is one paper. It's not even published yet. There's a bunch of stuff that hasn't been done in a systematic way. because there's sort of been a taboo against research on this, it's very thin. There's a huge amount of atmospheric science knowledge and environmental science over decades, but there hasn't been much explicit research on this topic. So the obvious question is this groupthink? Will some other paper show that we did it wrong?
Great, thanks. And if people want to learn more about the risk associated with heat impacts from climate change, they can go back to last season. We had a great conversation with the writer Jeff Goodell, who was published recently on heat impacts. And of course, we've mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson's book multiple times and how it opens with 20 million people in India dying as a result of an extreme heat event, and then India deciding to unilaterally deploy solar geoengineering. But let's bring Kim into the conversation. You're on the Climate Overshoot Commission. Maybe just before we dive down into your perspective on solar geoengineering, can you give us your sense from your participation in that commission? How are the geopolitics of climate change at the moment?
Well, they're pretty contentious, as they are all over the world. We're actually now getting down to the really nuts and bolts wrestling with the science as it's been given to us and the challenges of governance and all these other things to try and clarify a set of recommendations that we think could be helpful in creating a framework for dealing with climate overshoot, which appears to be on the horizon. And it's interesting because just recently, I gave a TEDx talk recently about climate overshoot, and most people hadn't heard about it. And within a few weeks, all of a sudden, there's more articles about the extent to which the trajectory of warming is alarming and exceeding people's worst expectations. So I think what's interesting is that we are now trying to figure out how we can be constructive, what we can say, recognizing that there still are a lot of unknowns and still things that are being published, and also a lot of interests out there that, from the greenwashing side of things, people who want to make things better and perhaps, and exaggerate the capacities of having a technological fix that doesn't require fossil fuel companies to lose their market share. While on the other hand, the concern of people who just see terrible things on the horizon and too many unanswered questions. So I hope that our report will be very, very helpful, but we're right down at the nitty gritty, and I wouldn't want to prejudge what we're going to say. But I think for most of us, this whole question of geoengineering is something relatively new, as something that could be. I mean, the whole idea of climate overshoot really does crystallize a whole set of possibilities that forces you to address certain issues. What will happen if we get into ranges of warming that are really having dire effects, and particularly that may create tipping points that are not recoverable from. And that's a very worrisome thing. So what is there within the arsenal of human ingenuity, if I can put it that way, that might help to forestall some of those worst consequences? And I've described, climate overshoot and our deliberations as comparable to Herman Kahn's book in 1962 about nuclear war. Thinking about the unthinkable. That we sometimes have to think about the unthinkable. And he wasn't advocating nuclear war, but he said, if you don't know what it would be and what are the best strategies for minimizing its bad effects if some idiot should decide to launch one, then it's pretty irresponsible. So there's two things from my perspective about our report and the exercise that we're dealing with. Is one, to try and clarify people's minds about what it means to get into an overshoot situation, that it's serious, it appears to be on the horizon, and we have to address it. But secondly, when you look at things like solar geoengineering and what it would involve, it also makes you realize there are no easy fixes. So if people are trying to suggest that, well, we don't really have to worry about it and we can keep emitting at this level, or we don't have to cut back our market share of world fuel supplies and stop using fossil fuels to create electricity, et cetera, because we have this other fix. That isn't true either. And I think the most sincere advocates for things like solar geoengineering would never make that statement. They don't see it as a substitute for mitigation. They don't see it as an ultimate fix. And so I think the whole moral hazard around the argument is something that really preoccupies us. If we say something favorable about this as a possible technology, does it undermine very important efforts towards dealing with the real issue, which is reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air and taking the steps necessary to do that? So I'm sorry, that's a long answer to a short question, but I think it was because we're right in the middle of thinking about it. All of these issues are very sort of front of mind, but there's not an easy answer. I mean, for example, even things like marine cloud brightening, it sounds like a very interesting thing, but there are, studies that suggest that it could have negative effects too. And what happens if you only cool one part of the atmosphere? What happens on the margins? I mean, all of these things that sound great, but you have to think about what are the other effects and who will most be affected by them. I'll stop for now because we'll come back to this question of the politics of it. But I think we'd say with respect to the commission, we are now in some ways at the hardest point to give you a clear view, because we're actually really immersed and chewing away at this in an effort to try and emerge at the other end of this with something helpful that makes sense of the science and the exigencies of Overshoot.
And thanks. That's helpful. We got a little taste of the commission's work. We spoke with Adrien Abécassis, I guess it was post-COP last fall. But I'm curious because whether we're talking about solar geoengineering or whether we're talking about climate overshoot generally, it's an uncomfortable conversation for people. And it's uncomfortable because I imagine with your work on the commission and within your other commissioners, people are saying, well, if you're planning for these dire consequences when global warming becomes dire, as you said, then we're succumbing to fatalism or we're being defeatist, and it is causing us a distraction. We're taking our eye off the ball when it comes to reducing emissions. How does the commission, I'm just curious, whether it's solar geoengineering in particular or climate overshoot generally, how does it push back on the people who say, we can't even go there, we just have to stay laser focused on emissions cuts and not even entertain something that, say, the fossil fuel companies in Canada who want to maintain that market share of world fuel supplies that you talked about, that will latch on to as an excuse for not reducing emissions?
I think, and David can correct me since he has been there at all of the meetings too, but I think that the commissioners are deeply committed to the notion that mitigation is the ultimate priority. But the problem is, it's like in the olden days when people didn't want to talk about adaptation. They said, well, don't talk about adapting to climate change because that just means you're suggesting it's going to happen. What we need to do is we need to prevent it. Well, we didn't prevent it. That's the whole problem. We have this is a huge failure of the world's commitment, and you can't pretend it's not happening. So you can't say we're not going to adapt to climate change because on principle we should be focusing on reducing emissions, and meanwhile people are dying and their homes are being washed away. And we have to do both, and the longer we delay in dealing with the emissions challenge, the more we create these other problems which can draw other resources and attention away. So I don't think that we have any doubt that the most important goal is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the air to be able to keep that 1.5 degrees Celsius cap on warming, and then from there begin to work our way back to a reasonable level of global temperature. But we aren't in control. If we could all wave our magic wands, it would be fine, but we're not. And people are doing these other things. So the question is, what does that mean? And if one of the points that we can make is, whatever these other technologies are, they are not quick fixes. And they are not a substitute. But it's, as I said, that moral hazard, that fear that we had years past in talking about adaptation, the fear that you'll distract attention or give aid and comfort to the many vested interests that are trying to persuade people that the science is uncertain and that it's not a big deal. I mean, this drives me crazy. I mean, I can, foam at the mouth when I think about that, but that's the reality. And I think what's particularly tragic about it is that policymakers, and again, many of us on the commission are current or former policymakers. Policymakers need to have constituencies for good policy. And when people are undermining people's sense that this is urgent, that the science is sound, and action needs to be taken, it becomes very, very difficult often for governments to make the decisions that they need to make, which is incidentally perhaps one of the reasons why so state and local or provincial local governments have sometimes had more success, because the constituency they need to take certain steps is smaller. It's not a national consensus. It's something smaller and more regional. But so we're very aware of the fact that if you give aid and comfort to people who are looking for ways of saying, it's not that big a deal, and so I don't have to make that change, and my business doesn't have to make that change, and my industry doesn't have to make that change, it's pretty disastrous. But at the same time, we also have to look at the reality. And Overshoot raises, I'll give you an example. If we do overshoot and people begin to realize that we have failed collectively to meet that Paris Climate Accord goal, some people, I hope, will hunker down and say, double down and say we have to do even more. Clearly, we have to make dramatic reductions in emissions, because that goal was important. It wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It's actually related to some real things. But if that's not the reaction, other people may say, well, it's such a disaster, we should risk whatever it is. In other words, the appetite for risk may change. So we need, in a sober, careful way now, to try and delineate what the risks are, or what the process should be to get more comfort with what those risks might be. And then, of course, that raises a whole other question of who gets to evaluate the risk, who gets to make the decisions. And the other big 800-pound gorilla in the room is that we do not have a global governance system that is equipped to make those kinds of decisions now.
Yeah, and further, I can't wait. We're going to get to governance. We don't really have a great track record of making democratic decisions right across the United Nations and all its member states. We have a very poor track record. Sarah, I'd love to get your take before we go to governance, just on the very notion of research, because I think my sense is no one within this virtual room today, certainly no one is saying don't worry about cutting emissions or investing in other ways to reduce the impacts of heat. Just do solar geoengineering. No one's saying that. No one's saying, I think, go out and start spending billions or tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars today on building delivery infrastructure and annual OPEX for large-scale solar geoengineering. We're not saying that, but we're going to say different things on the nature of what research should be done. And some academics out there are saying no research should be done, along the lines of the letter that came out recently saying, let's put down tools on researching AI for 6 months. Last year, an initiative led by Frank Bierman at Utrecht University came out called the International Non-Use Agreement on Solar Geoengineering, said, listen, there should be no public funding, no outdoor experiments, no patents, no deployment, and no support by international institutions. I'd love to get your take, Sarah, on do you think research should be done? And if yes, what is your response to that international non-use agreement and the concerns that they have?
Yeah, it was interesting to kind of prepare for this discussion, and obviously, reading a lot of what's been written by people who have thought much more deeply about this question than I have. And the two things that really stood out for me was, one is the, moral hazard question, and I have a few more thoughts that I want to add on that. But I think maybe even more centrally is really this question of the sort of special authority and priority that our research systems and our even sort of debate around, technology and all these things really give to the science and engineering side of questions over some of these questions around, you can put them in the social sciences or you can call them, governance, but sort of the way that we manage the technologies that we create. And I think it's fair to say that, looking backwards, historically, certainly within, Canada or the US or various other places, we've done a pretty impressive job of creating, research systems that can generate impressive technologies and kind of scientific and engineering advances. And we've done a pretty poor job of sort of creating the, the governance or the ability to understand how these are going to impact and how they should be used, the broader community, right? And you mentioned AI, and I think that's a really interesting example where, I mean, there was this, again, it's not an area that I follow closely, but sort of as a naive reader, reading this article in the New York Times recently where Geoffrey Hinton, one of the sort of, longtime AI researchers.
And Canadian.
Canadian. Yeah, there you go. It's very relevant. I don't know why it wasn't in the Globe and Mail, but anyway, he, come out and said, we should really take a step back, right, on what we're doing with AI, and very concerned about what's going on. And this got a lot of attention. But actually, I think one of the interesting things of that to me is that there's a lot of people along the way who, are maybe not coming from the engineering or science side around AI that have been raising these same concerns, right? And it's when someone who sort of comes with that background raises them, they do get a special kind of other attention. So all of that to say, I think that there is a very, maybe one of my most serious concerns is whether or not we're really prepared to manage a tool like this appropriately. And given that, what are the risks that come with developing it on the science, and actually doing the science and engineering to develop it? Because I think, for sure, once you have the tools, it becomes easier to use them. And so to me, then, I mean, I think one of the pieces, at least, of an answer to that is to say, well, if if we do think that somehow we want to continue or we want to accelerate scientific research in the area, I think, we have to have a very conscious effort to do as much or more research into the, social science and governance side of this along with it, right? And I think that, we're starting to dance around the edges of that in the way that, generally scientific funding now, there's an expectation in many cases to build more interdisciplinary teams that involve social scientists and to think about this. But I think if we're honest about it, we're only just really, starting to actually make that work. So I think that to me is one thing that's really front and center is how do we, if we think it's so important that we are going to go ahead with it, how do we use it as the case where we do the amount of social science work that's necessary along with the engineering to even have a hope of, being prepared to deploy it appropriately. And then the other piece is the moral hazard, which, I won't rehash. I agree with a lot of what was said there. I think one of the things that underlies that to me is this challenge of separating, the sort of scientific debate from the public debate. And I am concerned when you look at something like, the example of carbon capture and storage, where there are many people that, are working on this in good faith and wouldn't say that it should be used or that it's, a replacement for reducing emissions in a lot of other sectors. But then I look at the sort of public debate and the public policy that ends up getting made in a place like Alberta, where you do have, the oil industry pointing to carbon capture and storage and saying that is, one of the biggest pieces of what's going to be our approach to get to net zero, but it's not going to come until later. And so, I mean, it's a little hard to do the, experiment of if we didn't have that, CCS sort of sitting there, would we see a different discussion? And maybe there would, just be a different kind of technology that gets pointed to delaying action. But I do think that, it does certainly come up front and center in the conversations around, we're going to reduce emissions from our energy production in Alberta, but not yet. And we need more time, and it's going to happen via CCS. So, I mean, to me, that really is sort of the classic example of that moral hazard a little bit playing out in reality.
Yeah, question for David, since you're in the thick of it. I know for one, I would like to see further research done, and perhaps we all of us here want to see that to varying degrees. I'd like to see more on the risks and benefits and the trade-offs between things like precipitation and temperature, the potential negative effects on monsoon and rainfall. But to be clear, to understand, as we talked about earlier, what are the benefits relative to those risks? And to Sarah's point, of course, we do need, I would say almost on a one-to-one measure, we do need that research or discussion into what kind of governance structure that we can put in place. And when we look at treaties like Paris or the Landmines Treaty, are there bits and pieces that we can take from other areas where humans have come together, held hands and said, listen, looking, around the world. This is what is acceptable. This is what unacceptable. When the non-use agreement does raise thorny questions around things like outdoor experiments that could have localized effects. And of course, you were involved in that. You were involved in an initiative in Sweden that got some local pushback around that. Maybe give us a sense of that. How can you take the next step out of the lab, engage in an outdoor experiment in a way that isn't going to have a localized effect, or it's going to create something that would then be difficult to use the analogy, to get that horse back in the barn? As soon as you start talking about getting out of the lab and going into the field, that just raises the level of discomfort.
All good questions. So first of all, actually, I think in a way that's different from some previous technocratic research, a surprising amount of the total research has been social science related. Depending on how you measure it, it's a quarter to a half of all papers. Only about a quarter of all papers have been pure meteorology. So there's actually been really a lot. There was a point where there seemed to be more funded and more effort on social science here than on science. So there's been, in some sense, an extraordinarily self-reflective community, I think it's fair to say. I also think while we absolutely need discussions about governance, we need politics, we need good social science that really helps us understand what people think, what the determinants of what they think are. I think, with no disrespect to colleagues who do this, and I publish some of it too, there are really limits to what academics can say about practical governance. And one of the things that I found so exciting about being involved in the Overshoot Commission, other things where you get people like Ms. Campbell who actually have real experience in governance, is that I think there's often I don't think that just spending more money and publishing more governance papers necessarily makes governance easier. I think that the thing one needs to do is actually have legitimate, deliberative, democratic discussions with actual individual humans who don't have a big stake in this one way or the other, and with political leaders or ex-political leaders like Ms. Campbell. That's my sense of what we need, more than kind of more theoretical social science on governance. Two other things on the question of outdoor experiments. So you sort of implied that the outdoor experiment caused some local effects, or maybe long-lasting local effects. I think it's important to say that for the experiment we were involved in, even the Sami Council letter that argued that such experiments should never happen freely agreed that the experiment had no risks. So I think even the strongest opponent doesn't think it has a risk. I think the issue here is that people think there shouldn't be research because they're worried about this process going forward. And experiments have become the fight point for that research for reasons that are political, but not necessarily well-founded. My personal view is we should either have no research at all, including no talking about it and some rules to block research, which would be unprecedented almost in human history, but we could do it. Or we should have research that allows us to ask questions about nature, because I think that if you do purely research in computer models, you tend to be overconfident. And I think environmental science is founded on experiments where you try and understand what nature is doing. There's an enormous number of experiments that could be done that would have negligible environmental harms and are very similar to environmental experiments that are done already in environmental science. So I don't think the actual physical risk of the experiments is the issue. And if the issue is concern about the idea, which is a legitimate thing, what's so special about experiments? Why not also regulate computer models?
In the nature of solar geoengineering and the various approaches, are you going to, let's say we start spending tens or hundreds of billions of dollars today on not just research, but deployment, on the OpEx and building the infrastructure, are the effects going to be positive and negative? Are they going to be immediate, or are they going to be well into the future?
This is mixing up two massive different things. So I think it's important to say that research is tiny in terms of cost. The entire, to give you a sense of scale, the amount of money that we're now spending cutting emissions globally in new capital, solar, wind, batteries, is a little over $1 trillion a year. The amount of money we spend on energy R&D, hard to know, but many percent of that. The amount of money that we spend on all climate research is only a handful, $5+ billion a year globally. And the amount of money that people like me, but also the US National Academy and other things have suggested we spend on solar geoengineering research would be a few percent of that. So of order 50 or 100 million a year. There's no way, it would be nonsense to spend billions of dollars a year on research. Nobody's suggesting that. And I think, at least for me, I'm not advocating that we do deployment. I'm advocating that we know more because of this balance of evidence that this could be particularly useful, especially for people who are most at risk from climate change.
Yeah. And to be clear, I was suggesting tens or hundreds of billions for deployment, and maybe it's an order of magnitude less. I guess this is a research question. Can you figure out the time scale that it would take were we to actually go and do large scale deployment to start seeing the effects, the positive and the negative effects? Is that years in the future after you start deployment? Is that decades in the future?
I want to let Kim back in again. I'm really interested to hear her take, because I think one of the things that's so interesting is that Ms. Campbell's been come to this with this big experience in public policy, but new to this topic. And I kind of always think it's interesting what people who hear it fresh think. But the answer to the question depends on how it's done. So on how much you do. But if you did a gradual, slow ramp up, which is what I think the only thing that people like me would think is a reasonable thing to do, then you wouldn't be able to measure or the effects in terms of really seeing climate change on the ground for a very long time, which is, of course, the decades and decades, which is the same as we have for CO2. We've been putting CO2 in the atmosphere for a long time, and we know it's warming the planet, but we still don't know exactly how much it's warming the planet because there's all this background variability in the system. So the same would be true with this. You wouldn't see something right away with any sensible deployment.
Got you. And I do now want to take us to the governance question, and I do want to bring Kim back into the conversation. Thank you for waiting patiently. So, yeah, as David said, it's, this is, when we're talking about governance, this is really a discussion that should be led by people who understand governments and understand governance. You've run a government. What kind of structure how would governance work at the highest level? Who could we say would have the right to make those decisions on controlling the global thermostat? And to look at the very local or the very household level, I have difficulty just within my family in determining the right governance structure for our house thermostat, let alone trying to do this on a global scale. Kim, what work has the commission done, and what are your views?
I think what's very important is to understand that there are a lot of challenges to governance, and there are several different things you want to look at. There's the whole global north-south issue, that in fact the power to do many of these things exists in the wealthy countries of the global north, who are able to have the institutions, some of which like David's, who's going to several of them now, outstanding global institutions, have the heft and the resources to do that kind of research. But the effects are often felt in the global south. And so one of the things we've talked about is democratizing research so that the voices who are participating on the basis of looking at these issues in their own societies. But the broader you draw the scope of countries that need to be involved in the discussion, the harder it gets to create institutions. So like recently we've had the G7 summit meeting, and the G7, with the EU have made some really strong decisions in terms of the war with Ukraine and relationships with China, etc. But the bigger you get, the harder it is to create some kind of consensus that people can act on. But so there is a question of the quality of the decisions, the fairness of the decisions, and the legitimacy of the decisions. So, and the United Nations, the problem with the United Nations, it's an organization of sovereign states. And so when you look at the Paris Climate Accord, the kind of catch-22 of it was that it got this consensus to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius over industrial levels, but with no enforcement mechanism, in the sense that the countries were to create their own goals, their own plans, etc. So the broader the scope, often the weaker the actual mechanisms. So that's one of the issues that we're dealing with. Now, there have been, in the course of international relations, and particularly in the post-war period, the post-war period, we had some, World War II was a wonderful crisis to get us thinking collectively about some things. But I think there have been some issues, like the Montreal Protocol, like various environmental treaties that have in fact been able to create regimes with teeth and real commitment to make changes. And some of those might turn out to be useful templates for dealing with geoengineering. But I think, it's very hard. We don't have world government. We don't have the UN has lots of faults. It's the best we have in terms of bringing people together to talk about these things. But again, the broader the scope, the less likely you are to have actual levers of control. So one of the things we talk about when we're looking at these technologies is who funds it, because I think that one of the hardest things to really come to terms with is the extent to which there are highly funded interests in this world who don't want us to succeed, or who think that the kind of arrangements that we think constitute success are not necessary, that somehow there will be a way around this, that somehow their industries don't have to cut back or pay any kind of price. And they, in terms of everything that we do in governance, they are there putting a spanner in the works. So, you want to create the structures. And we talk a lot about the justice issues on the commission, because we recognize that this north-south thing, there is such a disequilibrium between those who are the emitters, those who are being affected by it, those who have the power to do the research, those who desperately, need whatever kind of mitigation effects might be created. It's not, it's uneven. So I mean, we're chewing away at this now, and I hope that we will come up with some useful recommendations. But even in terms of research, we say, if there is research, it should not be funded by any bodies that have a stake in the outcome in the sense of their own industry. So fossil fuel companies should not be funding research in geoengineering, because what their goal is usually to find a rationale or rationalization for not changing. They're one of the interests that doesn't really want us to make the kind of changes that many of us feel are necessary. So I'm sorry, that's not a very clear answer. But what I'm saying is that it's a very complicated and messy and conflict-ridden set of circumstances, but that there may be some templates, some examples that we can use from prior global arrangements dealing with environmental issues that might help us to create some kind of framework for governing at least the question of research, even before we look at the issues of deployment.
I think you hit the nail on the head with it is complicated, it's messy, there aren't easy answers. But this comes up on a regular basis, and essentially since the publication of Ken Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. So looking at you and your experience at the highest levels of government, if a country were now, let's just take as a hypothetical scenario, to unilaterally start deploying some form of solar geoengineering, and in the absence of that kind of agreement or that treaty in place today, what would the international response be, or what could it be?
Well, I think it could be, you could have, it depends on whether people think that it is in fact a terrible thing. And if they probably would think in governance wise it was, and you might get regimes of sanctions. You might have the kinds of responses that might actually undermine capacity for global cooperation. And that's the thing, that we need to maximize the capacity of the world community to think rationally about these issues. But again, we kid ourselves if we think that we all come to the table with the same set of issues. And I see this even within Canada. I spoke to the global leadership of one of our big oil companies a number of years ago, and they were sort of left in shock when I told them that they needed to take climate change seriously, and that they should be looking at what will be their value to their shareholders, and they should be saying, what are our resources, what is our infrastructure, how might we be part of a transition. And what would seem to me to make it infinite sense, and if I were one of their shareholders, I would want to say to them, okay, how can we move into the next stage of energy production? How can we be part of the solution? How can we use the things that we have to get into the next stage? But there's a wonderful book that was edited by the former head of Department of Cognitive Psychology at Yale, Bob Sternberg, called Why Smart People Can Be So Stupid. And one of the chapters in it was called The Myth of Rational Management. And it said people have all these models of CEOs having this, far thinking, and are they lateral thinking? But most of them make their decisions based on wishful thinking and denial. And so the notion that you can have people even leading huge, massive companies seeing themselves with the capacity to lead a transition, to continue to provide shareholder value, to do good things for the world, to have, instead what they do is that they punish their scientists. So they, like the guys at Exxon who gave up on the lithium batteries. I mean, they do all the wrong things because they're so short-sighted. So sometimes governments actually have to be more far-sighted than businesses are, even though businesses like to claim that they're the ones who are the big thinkers. So there's a lot of, flaws in the system and spanners in the works that make it hard for people to make good decisions. So I think if you can take pieces of it and at least say, is there some way we can create a fair regime for research to decide whether or not? And then the question of deployment would be a different one based on how comfortable we are with what research is telling us, and but also how hot and uncomfortable we are given our failure to reduce emissions.
I wanted to come back to something, David, you had made a comment and actually links to Kim, what you were just saying around kind of what happens if somebody goes ahead as to, have we ever shut down lines of research before? And I think that there is some parallels to what's happened in some of the human cloning type research. And again, I don't know this area very well at all, so it's maybe more of a question really. But I think that there are areas where we've said, like human cloning, that somehow we are uncomfortable with going there, and maybe the benefits are less clear, the case for doing so it's a little bit easier to say that we shouldn't be doing that. But I wonder about, are there sort of governance lessons that we can take from that, or is there actually even broader lesson that we're much more uncomfortable as humans with the idea of messing with humans than we are with messing with the Earth's ecosystem as a whole? But anyway, wanted to throw that in there.
Quick comment is, I think there's lots of technologies that were sort of feasible that people talked about that aren't deployed. So it's not true that we sort of deploy every technology we do. And it's, while human germline manipulation, there's a tension about and still a lot of research on. It's certainly true that there's very little research directly on human cloning, but there also isn't a formal international ban. And so this has happened by people turning away or a bunch of things that are weaker than the ban. And I think it's worth thinking about what would be the analogs or not to solar geoengineering.
All right, I'm going to turn us to the Q&A portion. We've got a little less than 15 minutes. Mike Hill, you've got a question for us. You're live.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if you think the ultimate decision to start geoengineering will actually occur in kind of either at the UN or even in Western democracies, or is it more likely that, a large state actor such as China will just identify it as necessary and just start deploying aircraft and acting, similar to, what would happen maybe with AI or even what's happened in the past with solar. I think once they decide it's a priority, it just happens.
You want to take that, Kim? Do you want to?
Well, I would think that maybe that David might have a better idea of where in the world this research is being carried out. And if in fact there are in China, places, India, places like that, are there people doing this kind of research, or is it largely confined to some of the major universities in United States and Britain? I don't know. I mean, the geography of research would make a difference at the answer to this question, I think.
Yeah, but it's the essential question. I really want to hear what you have to say. So on the issue of where research now is mostly where climate research is. So it's sort of coincident with climate research centers. And so that's mostly in the developed north, although there is significant research in say, India and China. So there's certainly some. But I think that, that is changing quickly. There is now an effort to really have a more global, inclusive, democratic research. And of course, it's good to have local research. And I totally support that. In terms of countries' actual deployment, you don't necessarily need the research to deploy because the underlying technologies for deployment are kind of already known in some cases, and research isn't really changing them. So I think the essence of that question to me is the really hard question, which is this likely to happen, as some on the progressive left assume, with kind of hegemonic Western powers do this first, or is it more likely that countries in the global south that are more affected by climate change see more immediate risks and have a kind of different profile of risk to benefits are more likely to push to do it first? I think I truly don't know. I think an outcome that I think is unlikely is that we get to deployment of solar geoengineering, say, in this half century by a process that's a pure kind of consensus-based UN process. My guess is that process, we need it, but I don't think it converges to an answer either sharply banning or deploying. And my guess is if this topic really gets on the agenda, it gets on the agenda because some small set of states put it there by taking an action that edged towards deployment. What do you think, Kim?
Well, I think that one of the things about multifaceted and a global approach to research is that it forces scientists to be cognizant of the interests of other countries and to have some sense of the proportion when we're talking about risks of how it actually affects people's lives. And I think that the danger is if just, a small number of American universities or British universities or, even Indian universities are doing this research without a clear understanding. So if we're going to have research, the more we can have consortiums of scientists and not just physical scientists and engineers, but also social scientists and others, part of the conversation. It might not create the kind of global consensus you're thinking of, but it certainly reduces the levels of great ignorance lacunae that can distort how people interpret and evaluate certain kinds of research outcomes, because it's very easy for us, we all see the world sort of through our own lens. We can't help that, but it may be a wake-up call if we are very aware of the research we're doing, how it's seen by others. So I think if we are going to have research, we should have a research that is funded probably by governments, not by private interests who may have a different goal, and also that to be as globally inclusive as possible, so that the reality of life as it is lived in many of these different countries and the impact that certain kinds of outcomes would have, because it's all very well to say, well, it's only a small risk and it might do this, but if doing this means that your country's entire agriculture is wiped out, for example, that's a very different view. So I think we need those voices. And that we need to have research structured in a way that tries to minimize the power of interests that, as I've said, are not really supportive. I mean, you see, the ideal aspect of geoengineering is that if we are deeply committed to mitigation, and we see that that's the path we have to go on, and we see geoengineering as simply tools to help us survive the interim period as we are doing everything we can to get carbon dioxide down. If these are survival techniques that enable us to minimize human suffering while we are still committing every resource possible to lowering the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's a very different question from using these because we think it buys us time to not be serious about mitigation. And those are two totally different mindsets.
Beautifully said, Kim. Man, you just everything you just said, I agree with. What you said about the necessity of a more democratic global research, because people need to live in countries that really understand in a more holistic way what impacts for those countries really mean and how people think about the values. And then what you said lastly, I always hate the idea that solar geoengineering is buying time, because there's no way to say that except that you're just going to emit more. I think what it might be doing is getting us less risk. So I just thought that last set of things you said was right.
But I think also reducing human suffering. I mean, I think, we know that we're going into overshoot, and we know that means terrible things for some people in some places more than others. And that is, as somebody who comes from a big emitting country, one of the biggest emitters per capita, I think that's a terrible thing. I don't want people to suffer. But if there's a way of alleviating that suffering without undermining the whole project, or perhaps even if it can help make people more serious about the need to double down in dealing with emissions, that's a good thing. But the worry is that won't be the case. It's up to us to make it. And if people can engage with their democratic institutions and feel a sense of global citizenship in doing this, great. And there have been certain crises in the world, where people have done that. And
Our responses to this question, we've just highlighted some of the rubs associated with solar geoengineering and climate mitigation generally. For example, Kim, I heard you say we're going into global overshoot, climate overshoot. I think that, but I would say I can look at a bunch of climate activists out there that I know who would say, no, that's not the case. We still have time. Let's just focus on emissions reductions. We've talked about funding for it. And I heard you say, and I agree with this, that it should be public funding and not private funding. And yet we've got the international non-use agreement folks who are explicitly saying no public funding. We agree
and no
that
IPCC, no assessment as well, which I find really amazing.
Yeah, we're also saying that we think there should be a global governance structure, and it needs to include strong representation from the South. And yet I, for one, am pretty pessimistic that, it's difficult enough on Paris. And Paris was remarkable. You had some 190 some odd member states who agreed to something. but without real teeth. It's really aspirational, as good as it is. And yet solar geoengineering, I think it's going to be difficult to get to that kind of widely adopted understanding and treaty. And then lastly, last comment on Mike's question, it's completely binary. If it's the US or China that starts doing this, the global response is going to be very different than if it's a small country doing this, because who is going to want to take on the United States or China if they decide they're going to do this? But any other country pretty much is, as long as you have the United States and China saying, we're uncomfortable with this and we're going to intervene, then that country gets shut down. That's my sense.
Well, I think it's also important to recognize that from what we understand now about solar radiation management, we're using aerosols. This is not a regional thing. You don't just do it above your own country. The aerosols disperse, so that you have a global effect. So I think that you're not going to be able just to get away with it. It is going to have an impact. Or there's going to create responses from other countries.
Agreed. All right. We have one more questioner, Marina Dutra Trindade. Apologies if I've butchered your name, but go ahead, Marina.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. You pronounced my name correctly, by the way. But just I wanted to ask from a perspective of envisioning a future of climate management so that these approaches can be coordinated, because I'm trying to think of to what extent do we want to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement? To what extent are they an end and not a means? Because I'm thinking about biological diversity and photosynthesis and all these issues. I'm a lawyer. Sorry, I don't have a lot of knowledge. So I was also asking about whether to develop within the IPCC or different forms of mechanisms of science policy interfaces so that these conversations can be had, and also with more involvement from social sciences. And I was just really wondering, because, nature interests have to be there. And if we do allow ourselves to continue emitting greenhouse gases and then doing geoengineering so as to prevent our lifestyles and human activities as we have been doing, how can we put nature into that so that its ecosystems, especially delicate ones, don't have to be sacrificed in the trade-off? I'm thinking of a coherent type of approach, because we have a lot of norms in the international environmental law. So this is what I'm trying to, integrate everything. And also the termination shock, just on the termination shock, whether you would see it being, using, for example, side projects so that we don't have to have the termination shock when we finally manage to tackle the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Thank you so much.
Sarah, let's go to you for comment, but David, would better get comment from you or a definition of what Marina means by the termination shock. But Sarah first.
Yeah, I was interested to hear what Kim has to say on this. Actually, I think the this question of balancing the needs of sort of other species is probably another area where it's I think we would prioritize human well-being in many cases over the others. And sometimes they go in the same direction, but to me, it's another sort of example of where it's worrying in terms of, do we really have the tools to appropriately deploy this technology? And therefore, then, should we be?
Termination shock is the idea that if you're doing solar geoengineering and suddenly stop, you get a sudden warming of the climate, which would be harmful. And that is absolutely true. The extent to which that is a risk depends on the alternatives of how you might slowly stop instead of quickly stopping. And of course, what combination of countries or powers want some different thing. So that was a great question that rolled up so many of the hard questions. We could talk for hours, but I guess it's over to Kim for some closing thoughts.
Well, I'm interested to know what happened after the Mount Pinatubo eruption as the aerosols dissipated. Was there a termination shock, or was there a gradual readjustment? But just I would say my last comment is, I think research is inevitable. I don't think you can put that issue back in the bag. But I think the most important thing is that whatever research there is, can we do it with the presumption that our conclusion might be that this is not something we should do, as opposed to researching it to death until we convince ourselves we found a way of doing it. And the ability, because I think a very powerful statement is, we have researched this, and this is not a tool that's available to us with any reasonable, acceptable costs, whatever that the costs are too great, and therefore we don't have that as a fail-safe device, and that means emissions management is really our only way out of this situation. And that's a very reasonable conclusion to draw based on whatever it could be a reasonable conclusion to draw based on certain research outcomes. But I think the research will happen. But can we be honest about what it tells us? And if we can be, then I think we have some hope.
Very well said. What's the stopping rule for research is one way to think about it. Very well said.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say right on, listening to the concluding comments of the Right Honourable Kim Campbell.
My sister calls me Right Honey, so whatever you want to use of my title, it's okay.
Yeah, I feel like we've got to know each other, but not that familiar yet. So.
we're not on Right Honey terms yet. No.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time. We know that it's later in your evening in Florence, Italy, but you've added such wonderful color and experience to our conversation today. And one of the thorniest conversations that I think we've had on energy versus climate. So thank you.
Thanks for convening us.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinijescu. Thanks to Hannah Tai, Priyakuni Krillatho, and Crystal Hickey for their production support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners find the show. You can also send your feedback to info@energyversusclimate.com. That's it for Season 4 of Energy versus Climate, but stay tuned for some bonus episodes dropping this summer. We'll be back in the fall with another season. See you then.